Values are derived from valuations. Valuations are made by valuers. All values are subjective. Where I derive this, what it means, and how it influences how we live today, all discussed during Talking Philosophy. So the other day, I'm engaged in a conversation on the comments section of the Philosophy Tube YouTube page. If you haven't tried Philosophy Tube, there's a link on my main page. Anyway, we're talking about ethics, and I keep coming back to James's paper, The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life, and trying to explain to this person that all value is subjective. All morality is subjective. He keeps telling me that 61% of all philosophers today indicate that they think philosophy is objective. Well, I obviously am in the minority here, but I think they're wrong. And I think using James as my model, I can demonstrate to you just how they are wrong. The first thing to bear in mind is that morality is a system of values. It gets lumped in with other theories of value, such as aesthetics, economics, the study of truth, and math. All of these things discuss value, and what I want to do today is illustrate to you that each of these systems of value ultimately only means something, only even can be said to exist if there is a subject which intends something about the world, making it a subjective claim. So let's run through that list again. First, we have economic value. What is something worth? What would we pay for it? What would we give to get it? We'll show that that's intrinsically subjective. Aesthetic value, beauty, or sublimity. Either way, what we're talking about is how works of art, things that affect us emotionally, things that we label beautiful. Where does the justification for that label come from? And I'm going to suggest it's subjective. Then we'll take a look at the thing that got me started on all this, moral value. Bear in mind, as we talk about value, all we're really talking about is does something mean something to us? Does it bring something to us? Does it have a value for us? Sometimes we'll talk in terms of standards. I mean, come on, that's what they call it in the entertainment industry on television. It's the Office of Standards and Values. What we're talking about here, we're talking about a standard, is simply what justifies value. So if a value is, in fact, subjective, the standard is, in fact, subjective. And again, we'll see that in ethics, in morality, it's all subjective. When we move to truth value, you may put up a little bigger fight. But I think you'll find, as we examine it closely, there's no need to, and nothing lost in saying it. But again, where do we get there? Lastly, mathematical value, and that's the one that everybody's really going to try to take me to the floor on. But why don't you hear me out and see if you don't agree that even mathematical value is essentially subjective. Okay, economic value. Economic value. What is something worth in terms of the work you'd give for it, the other goods and services you'd trade for it? This, I mean, as I say those words, obviously is about me, what I would give, what I would trade, or what a group of people would give or trade, or under any circumstances, sentient beings see as the worth, the value of some object in the world or some service in the world. My favorite example of all time comes from Antiques Roadshow, the PBS version, not the BBC version. Gentleman brings in a blanket that has been draped over the back of the couch in his mother's living room as far back as he can remember. Before that, he remembers it in his grandmother's living room. It's always been just a blanket over the back of a chair. He brought it in because he knew it was an old, or at least older, Navajo blanket and thought he'd like to find out if it was worth anything. Well, when he arrives on Roadshow, the gentleman tells him, "Your blanket is a national treasure. It's worth at least $100,000. And the guy goes, "But it was just draped over the back of the couch." Yeah, it was just draped over the back of the couch. And as long as it was draped over the back of that couch, that's all it was worth. There was no one to give it a greater value than that. And had it in the end spent the rest of its days on the back of the couch, that's all it ever would have been worth. Come on, it's not even worth $100,000 unless you can get somebody to pay that for it. I mean, that's one of the things that always irritates me about Antiques Roadshow is these people seem to think because the valuer tells them it's worth this much money, that that's money in the bank. They can cash that tomorrow if they want to. No. Everything has to find a market in order to be valuable. A market is people. It's not. There's no objective market out there. There's only a subjective market. Let me give 3 more illustrations on how value is dependent on the mind of the valuer by falling back on one of my favorite books, By the Great Horn Spoon. It was written by Sid Fleischman, and it's written for like, say, a 4th through 7th grader. But it's a great deal of fun. Disney turned it into a movie, The Adventures of Bullwhip Griffin. Though to be fair, the movie doesn't have all the worth of the book. But the fact demonstrated here is that value is in the mind of the person who evaluates it. The first example comes fairly early in the book. Real quick sketch of the plot. A butler and the young man of the house go to the gold rush in California to save the family by making money in the gold mines, the gold fields. When they are on their trip, they encounter 2 men who are hoping to strike it rich in California. One is a man with a great many potatoes. He has put them into barrels and he's trying to bring them to market in San Francisco. However, the trip has taken longer than was expected and his potatoes are beginning to spoil. He's thinking that they are now worthless. On the other hand, there's a French gentleman who's bringing clippings of vines, grapevines from France, and he wants to plant them in California. But again, because the trip has taken longer than expected, there's not enough water on the ship to be spent on his grape cuttings. Each believes that what they have is worthless. Each tells this to our heroes, whereupon the heroes bring the 2 together and everything changes. The valueless potatoes become invaluable, absolutely the most important thing in the life of the Frenchman who wants to plant grapes in California. Likewise, the grapes, which were going to be bad and useless, come back into a viable source for money in the future. Why? Not because they were valueless and then valuable in some absolute sense. They were valueless because no mind came up with a way to make them useful, and then they became valuable because some mind thought up a way to make them useful. Just that simple. The value exists purely as the product of a mind. Were there no mind there, there'd be no value there. Okay, the second example I want to give you of how a subject makes value possible economically is in the purchase in the diggings that our hero, Jack, makes of a barrel of neckties. Now, he doesn't mean to buy the barrel of neckties. Everyone says, oh, Jack, what a raw deal. Sorry you got stuck with the neckties, but you made the gesture, and so it has to be sold, and you're the guy that's going to have to pay for it. Nothing to worry about here, because on the next day, word is a beautiful young woman is coming to town, and everyone wants to meet the beautiful young woman, and everyone wants to cut a good image for the beautiful young woman, so everyone in town wants a necktie. Jack's $8 purchase turns into an $800 score as he sells off the ties. What changed? The neckties didn't change. The woman coming to town is a change, but just somebody being in a town, how does that affect the price of neckties? What changed was attitudes toward the neckties. The subjective attitudes toward the neckties changed their value. Now, the last example, let's reverse things. I've shown you how worthless things turn out to have worth when the subject changes its approach to the thing. Let's go the other way, seeing worth disappear as the subject changes. The value of the one most important item in the whole book is the value of a treasure map that is to lead our heroes to the biggest gold strike in the whole of California. When our heroes finally find the map, they find that the strike has been discovered by someone else. In fact, a lot of someone else's. And there are mines and diggings and pannings going on all over the area that they believe to be absolutely, objectively valuable to them. They were wrong. What happened? Where did the value go? Well, it isn't like it got absolutely abstracted away. It didn't go away. It couldn't go away if it were objectively so, because it would be in the thing. The value changed because the attitudes of our characters change. The subjective state of mind toward the object, the map, changed. And with that change, the value disappeared. Let me just say it one more time before we go any further. If this is true of economic value, as I think I've just done a pretty good job of demonstrating, why shouldn't it be true of all forms of value? Value is subjective. Why is some value subjective and other value not subjective? Well, that's up to somebody else to prove. I'm going to stand on my contention that value, all value, is subjective. Now, when I turn to aesthetic value, or beauty, or sublimity, if you prefer, all we're talking about is how viewing something, hearing something, tasting something, smelling something, how some kind of sensory input affects our minds. You look at a work of art and you find it beautiful. I look at it and I find it ugly. Which of us is wrong? Well, everybody we know around us will tell us beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And they're right. I mean, this one is so easy to convince you of, it's hardly worth making the trip. In fact, let me set something up so you understand that the trip is actually worth the making. When I worked at the Virginia State Library and Archives back in the 80s, there was a book I cataloged on music appreciation, musical criticism, where the gentleman writing the book suggested that all music was good or bad insofar as it approximated the work of Richard Wagner, whose music was perfect. The objective perfection of musical composition. Thus, Bach was inferior to Mozart because Mozart was more like Wagner than Bach was. Except, of course, when he wasn't. But each time, all that really matters is how close you are to Wagner. How close you are to what this gentleman proposes is not his standard, but an objective standard of perfection. Well, we would all laugh. We do. We sneer at anybody who would think that way. We say to people, no, 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 no. I have standards. You have standards. And in both cases, you can't complain about those standards. They're ours. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So is economic worth. Remember? Value, as I've suggested already, has to have a valuer. A valuation made on a thing gives it value. A valuation must be made by a valuer. There is no such thing as an absolute valuation. Now, to discuss moral value. For this, I'm just going to refer back to William James's article and the metaphysical problem that he deals with in The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life. In it, he notes, when there are no sentient beings, there is no morality. Morality needs a person who is capable of intent and of decision. Note, I don't say free choice, I just say decision. So, for rocks, morality is not an issue. For the waves, morality is not an issue. For anything not capable of choosing one way or another, deciding by some internal intentional means, which is what consciousness implies, without that, there is no morality. Morality doesn't even come into the world with the first sentient being. It takes two interacting to make morality a necessity, to make it a possibility in our world. It's something that's necessary because we're going to make our best efforts to discover it so we know how best to act toward one another, and a possibility because these are the minimum requirements. If you don't have two sentient beings interacting, it is impossible to have morality. They are sentient, they are conscious, they are subjects, and without them, morality is impossible. Just that simple. Moral value requires an intellect to exist. If it's dependent on a mind for its existence, it is subjective. Just that easy. But before we move on, let me remind you that for James, we're not saying that an objective morality isn't possible, but that morality has to be discovered through an investigation of the human condition. And until the last person has had the last say on moral issues, we will not know that possibly objective reality. In the meantime, the only reality we have, the only morality we have, is subjective. Now we come to truth value. A lot of people are going to be saying there has to be objective truth. Every theory of truth I am aware of looks for a correspondence between reality and statements, or reality and thoughts, or reality and judgments. If the correlation exists, if the causal connection exists, however you want to look at it, the important part is Truth is not a property of reality. Truth is something the mind extracts from reality. Now, I don't really like that term reality, and we'll talk more about that later. But let's, for just a second, say this. Truth is either a correspondence between external worlds and my internal states of affairs. It is a coherence between internal states of affairs and the world out there. Or it is some other successful means of projecting the future based on my current awareness. All of these add up to I have to be part of truth. I may or may not be a necessary component of reality, but I am a necessary component for truth. Since truth then is dependent on the subject for its existence, all truth is subjective. What we are saying, what everyone has always been saying, going all the way back to Plato, is that truth is a correspondence, a coherence, a successful relationship of some kind between minds, statements, which are produced by minds, ideas, which are produced by minds, and the external reality, if an external reality exists. This is subjective. Truth exists in minds, not in reality. Reality is something else. When somebody says to you, well, this is my reality, they're lying. This may be their truth, although I have a hunch it's not that either. But clearly, you don't own your own reality. Reality is, well, like I say, we'll talk about it more later. But don't let that get in your way of understanding that truth is mind dependent and so subjective. This brings us to the last of our values for examination, mathematical value. You're saying, how on earth can mathematical value be mind dependent? Well, again, ask an oyster how many oysters there are. No idea. Why? Because it doesn't matter to an oyster. It doesn't matter to a tree. It doesn't matter to the wind. These quantities don't matter. They only matter. They only have value to sentient minds. Sentient minds find it important to know what's the number. They need that number. It means something to them. They create the value. Again, just when we look at reality, again, peace on that term. When we look at objects in the world, how we count those objects is up to us. Is it one mountain or two? One cloud or four? How many continents are there? These countings are all our choices. How we group things are our choices. Well, 1, 2, and 3, you say, well, again, no. The numbers themselves, when we're acquainted with, as most of us are today, base math, or when we're talking about flock math, any number of approaches to math, we'll find that counting isn't as simple as it looks. Numeric assignments are essentially arbitrary, depending on the mind for existence. And perhaps again, most importantly, is that it is only to minds numbers matter. The temperature of the universe is cold. It's cold. That's not a quantity. That's not a number. It's cold, except it's not cold because it's the temperature of the universe. How can the common mean temperature of the universe be cold? It's the temperature things are. Oh, but it's cold because some mind labels it cold. It's, what is it, minus 238 Kelvin? That makes it cold. Why is it cold? No, it's 0 Kelvin, minus 238 Fahrenheit, I think. Don't hold me to that. It might be Celsius. But the whole point here is that the numeric assignment is purely our doing. The labeling, even quality-wise, of cold is our doing. We designate these numbers. We label this reality. It is our minds, our counts, our choices, our using of numbers. Again, the numbers don't matter to the world out there. You know, hell, it don't even matter to the world in here. I always loved how my late wife would get upset over not having worn her Fitbit, as if somehow her body didn't know that she'd walk the steps she walked when she wasn't wearing a Fitbit. That's ridiculous. The world does what it does without numbers or qualities or anything. We need the numbers. So we create the numbers. Numeric value, mathematical value is mind dependent. As I've said before, if any of these values have I've convinced you in some way that they're subjective in kind, then you have to at least consider the possibility that all values are subjective in kind. Why should there be two kinds of values? Why shouldn't there just be one kind, namely the subjective kind? So let me repeat what we said at the outset. All values derive from valuations. All valuations require a valuer. All values are subjective, even the ones you thought weren't. Please subscribe. If I get 100 subscribers, I can get a personalized URL, which will make marketing much easier. If you want to talk more philosophy in the future, ring the notification bell. If you have comments, please make them below. I will respond as quickly as possible. Lastly, if you enjoyed the program, please share it with your friends.